Let me turn that off so you can hear me better. Sorry about that. So welcome. My name is Samantha Musoke. Some of you know me. I'm seeing lots of familiar faces in the room, and I'm the IFR4NPO Project Director for Humentum. And you're really warmly welcome as invited participants from Northern America, US and Canada. So this is the third of 13 regional events we're holding in coming months. And this is the first of 2 sessions that we'll be having together. I'm joined by Karen Sanderson, who's the IFR4NPO project lead at CIPFA, who'll be taking us through the majority of our time together today. It'd be great if you would take this opportunity to introduce yourself in the chat, just with your name, your organization and the country. And that will just be great at helping us know exactly, and for everybody else to know who we've got in the room. Great. So I'm delighted to say we also have with us Humentum's CEO, Christine Tsao, who'd like to say a few words of welcome. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, Sam, and hello, everyone. I'm Christine Tsao. I'm Humentum's CEO and president. I'm really happy to be here today with you. I'm so excited about how the IFR4NPO project is taking momentum and just the amazing representation and interest we're seeing from everywhere across the globe. So it's really exciting to be with you today. I'm going to spend a little time with you. And I've also joined some of the other consultations, and I'm really happy to be, participating with those of you in North America today, and have been on some other meetings as well. I will just comment, yes, I do have a dog in my lap, such as life working from home, but she's very happy to join us as well. So I really wanted to take this opportunity just to underscore how important I think the IFR4NPO project is in the context of what we are all referring to as localization, democratization, decolonization, talking about shifting power. I think it's a great example of how we are really working to even the playing field for organizations across the globe. I have been focusing on that as a real priority for Humentum, thinking through what are those operational obstacles and bottlenecks that we can help with and help resolve to be able to allow all organizations that want to work in the global development sector to be able to have the correct tools and resources to allow them to do that. We're seeing that those obstacles being acknowledged at all levels. Just last week, the EU Commissioner Janez Lenarčič created a stir when he said the biggest barrier to localization is the administrative capacity of local actors when it comes to accountability, transparency, and sound financial management. We are all very aware of that, and we know that the work that you all are contributing to with IFR4NPO is really going to help contribute to creating stronger tools and resources around administrative capacity and financial management. There are many solutions. They are complex. They include financial reporting standards as an important way to create that level playing field. In the USA and in Canada, the standards we have define and harmonize accountability and transparency and have had a huge impact on public confidence and the credibility really in the sector. Many countries, most countries perhaps, lack such standards. And so we have an opportunity to be part of helping to fix that. We are not looking to dictate or copy and paste a northern standard for the world, and that's precisely what is so exciting about the IFR4NPO project. And right now we have people from 105 countries participating. That's really groundbreaking, I think, in terms of having collective action to develop and adopt policy and standard solutions. And so, I think also what we do know is that diversity of representation, diversity of thought, diversity of expertise and experience leads to more successful products, whether it's in the private sector, business, creating new products, or whether it is in developing global standards, we know that they are going to be stronger if we have a wide breadth of contribution to those standards as they are put together. I'm really happy that Humentum and CIPFA are at the center of this work. We love our collaboration with CIPFA and are so happy to work with you. These are long meetings, and obviously the consultation paper is not a bedtime read, hope not, because you won't get very far. So this is a complex initiative, and we all need to keep going with it. I saw somebody the other day refer to, I think, the pandemic as, it's not a sprint, it's not an ultra marathon, it's a triathlon. In some ways, I think the IFR4NPO initiative is a bit of a triathlon as well. But again, it's been really exciting to see over the past year how much momentum we've built up together. So, working for an NPO or for a donor, being part of accounting consultations isn't necessarily in your job description, but I want to thank everybody for being here and for your engagement in the initiative. I particularly want to thank our US country champions and our Canada TAG member, as well as Dorothea Malloy from USAID, who's part of our technical and practitioner advisory groups. I want to actually call out USAID in particular, because having a donor as part of this is really, really critical to the success of the initiative. And so, seeing that we are getting folks from both sides of the aisle, as it were, interested and engaged in this is really, really important. So thank you all. I'm going to stop here and not take more of your time, but I am really pleased to see everybody on the call, and we'll look forward to hearing more. Thank you. Over to Sam.
Thank you so much, Christine. It's just great to hear that welcome from you. Thank you so much. So without further ado, we can move on to our agenda for the day, which you can see here. We've got a lot to get through, so we will move fairly swiftly and respect your time. If you've got questions or comments, please do use the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer these in the session. If not, we can follow up after the meeting. We really hope you're looking forward to sharing your thoughts in the times we've set aside for these breakout groups. Today's discussion is intended to help you better understand the consultation paper, and for us as a project to hear your thoughts. And just to be clear, it doesn't constitute a formal response to the consultation. So we'd strongly encourage you to submit your own response separately, and we'll tell you how to do that in the next meeting. Can you hear me all right, Karen, or should I turn off my video?
No, we can hear you fine. Thanks, Sam.
Oh, great. Okay, so I'll just double check. So let me start this meeting with a very brief project overview, particularly for those of you who may not have previously attended one of the awareness meetings we had last year. But it's so important to be clear that there really is a problem. This project really is needed. So some of the current challenges experienced around the world by non-profit organizations, by funders and auditors and regulators do stem from this fact that there is no internationally agreed standard for NPO general purpose financial reporting. And this results in inconsistency, in duplication, burden, and high costs. Fundamentally, it damages the trust and credibility in the sector. And those countries that lack a national standard for nonprofits feel it most acutely. So it's our real hope that once the guidance we're developing is widely adopted by different jurisdictions and endorsed as best practice by donors, it will help build a more resilient and accountable sector. It'll create a level playing field for access to funding, as Christine mentioned, and bring more equity. Jeff Mechanic, who's our TAG member from FASB in the US, did a poll recently of some US foundations, and 65% of them said that who are making grants internationally felt that this guidance would be helpful to their due diligence processes. So we can really see there a practical outworking of how this might happen. So our meetings so far have been in East and West Africa and South Asia. And obviously the context in the US and Canada is really different. So our small group discussions, I think, will be less around discovering what is on the ground, because as a project, we're already quite familiar with that. But I think more reflection about which aspects of what we have could be useful in an international context. Also, if we have roles as grantors to entities abroad, or we have offices and operations abroad, I think that will also bring really valuable context and input. Okay, so the project's being led by Humentum and CIPFA, both non-profit organisations ourselves. So this is a by the sector for the sector. We have these wonderful advisory groups, our practitioner advisory group, and I know Dorothea is here, drawn from different parts of the globe with different roles. We have our technical advisory group, and Ingrid and Jeff are here with us, drawn from accounting standard setting community around the world. And then we're supported by country champions who support us to raise awareness of the project in their countries. Thank you, Ivona, who's here as well from the US. And then we're soon to be launching the donor reference group, which is in its forming stage. And some members here are part of that group, which hasn't yet met, but it's growing. And then the project's also overseen by a small steering group. So all these wonderful members work on a voluntary basis, and there's more information about them on the website. So I won't mention everybody here today, but just so that you know that those members who are from TAG and PAG and Country Champions, when they're speaking today, they're speaking on their own behalf, which is great to hear their views as individuals and the organisations they represent. So the project's being delivered in 3 phases, consistent with the processes used in setting all international accounting standards. We've just completed the first phase with the publication of the consultation paper at the end of January. And we're now moving into a development phase. And with these meetings with you, we'll provide important input to the next steps in the project. The timetable for the rest of the project will depend on the amount and the nature of the feedback to this consultation paper, but we're working towards draft of the guidance in mid-2023 and then final guidance in mid-2025. Okay, so you can see from this snapshot here that we've made really fantastic progress, as Christine mentioned, in raising awareness and engaging stakeholders all over the world. But we still have a long way to go, and we still need your help in reaching out to colleagues that you have around the world and within your countries to get more people on board. So with that really brief introduction, let me hand over to Karen, the project lead from CIPFA, who'll take us through an introduction to the consultation paper and our topics today. Thanks, Karen. I think you might be on mute, Karen.
Yep. Okay. Can you hear me now? Right. Okay. Great. Thank you. Sorry for the mute point. I think that's something everyone has struggled with over the last year, speaking whilst on mute. But I'll try not to do it too often. So as you've heard, the objective of this project is to provide guidance that is internationally applicable and that can address known problems with NPO financial reporting. And we've developed 3 objectives for developing the guidance. The first is concerned with, bring them up, is, oh dear. Sorry, I had this problem last week with my mouse. Let me go back. I will skip over those. So we have 3 objectives for developing the guidance. The first is concerned with improving the quality, transparency and credibility of financial reports from non-profit organisations, to have international high quality guidance that is relevant no matter where you are in the world. That's really important to us. And the second objective is about providing information that is useful to users of financial reports, and in doing that, trying to balance the needs of both users and preparers. And the final objective is around NPO-specific accounting issues to try and promote comparability across NPOs. So as we are developing the guidance, everything that we will do will be done with relevance to those objectives. So where do we start? For any of you that have looked, you'll find that there's a lot of information in this consultation paper, but the bulk of the material is in part 1 and part 2. which we will go through as part of our outreach sessions. And the intention of the consultation paper is to engage with the community globally about what is needed to improve financial reporting for the sector. And everybody can input and contribute to that. Part 1 of the consultation paper is broken into 5 chapters. In our meeting today, we'll be considering the first 3 chapters of part 1. And this is focused on who are the users of financial information, who are NPOs, and also the key premises that sit behind the development of the guidance. So those are the things that I'll come to in a second. Chapters 4 and 5, which are shown here, we'll cover in our next meeting next week, when we'll look at some of the issues behind that. The consultation period for part 1 extends to the 30th of July of this year. And part 1 is kind of looking at the kind of the general landscape issues for the sector. Part 2 of the consultation paper, on the other hand, is looking at specific accounting issues for NPOs. And we'll look at in our next meeting about kind of how did we come to our list of NPO issues and how we got to our short list of issues that we're intending to cover in our guidance. But there's quite a lot of material in there, and we'll be holding further outreach sessions later on in the year to look at the specifics about what is in each of those issue papers. Because there's quite a lot here, the consultation on these topics is extended a bit further, and that will close on the 24th of September of this year. So that's just kind of giving you sort of the key sections of the consultation paper. So now I'm going to turn to the topics for today. And starting with who do we mean by NPOs, and looking at the definition of those. In the consultation paper, we're proposing that non-profit organisations are defined with reference to 4 broad characteristics. In the work that we've done, we don't think that we can provide an internationally applicable definition that works in every jurisdiction. A single definition wouldn't actually work in these situations. And I should be clear that when we're talking about non-profit organisations, there are other terms that the people are familiar with in terms of the sector. So you might be more familiar with the term NGOs or charities, and we have to remember specific organisations like churches, membership organisations, trusts, and even universities and hospitals can fall within the realm of these kinds of entities. So we are proposing a characteristics approach where an organisation might be an NPO if it meets any combination of the 4 criteria that are on the slide here. And 3 of the 4, the first 2 and the 4th one, are really about operating for social benefit. In other words, not operating for a return to providers of resources. So about delivering services for public benefit. If profits or surpluses are made, that those are directed for the benefit of service recipients, not to the benefits of anyone who has provided funding. And similarly, assets are also held for the potential that they have in providing services, not to generate returns for investors. The third characteristic that we have here is about voluntary donations. Not all NPOs may have voluntary donations, but they can be a critical way of identifying non-profit organisations from perhaps the public sector, which also operates for social benefit, but does not rely on voluntary donations, as we all know as taxpayers, in the way in which they operate. So those are the 4 characteristics that we're looking at. The question that frequently comes up was around, well, aren't there already frameworks that exist that we could use? And that's absolutely right. There are already definitions of non-profit organisations. But in the work that we've done, we don't believe that these are designed for financial reporting purposes. So the statistical kind of approach that looks at whether bodies operate in the public or private sectors, or whether they have market operations or non-market operations, doesn't pick up some of the entities that sit on the boundary or the cusp of those, particularly in the private sector. So we think those definitions don't quite fit and that we need one of our own. So that's a bit of an introduction to who might we mean by NPOs. The other part of this, which is covered in chapter 2, is looking at stakeholders and their needs. And there seems to be a theme of 4 here, but the consultation paper proposes 4 main stakeholder groups. So that's service users, the people that actually benefit from the work of a non-profit organisation. Resource providers, those are the groups that provide funds. They could be donors, members of the public, or they could be banks as providers of finance. Regulators, those who set the reporting requirements for non-profits. And we've also included in here society at large. I think we believe that members of the public put trust in non-profit organisations to work in the best interests of their community, and that they are a relevant stakeholder group to be considered as well. The consultation paper also proposes 4 main areas of interest for stakeholders, which capture their needs of financial information. And the 4 that we've identified are whether a non-profit organisation is meeting its objectives, is it operating in a way that maximises economy, efficiency and effectiveness? Is it complying with restrictions or regulations? That could be restrictions how monies can be applied. And is it operating with regard to its longer term health, or is it being very short-sighted in what it does? And these needs are intended to support accountability to a full range of stakeholders for those accountability and decision making. And as we're looking at this, we're not looking at any one stakeholder group, but things that are in common across all of these stakeholder groups. And so we're very conscious of donors as a group in that regard, and that's a theme we see time and time again, but this is looking at the generality of what's there. So having introduced those, we will start to move into breakout groups. But before we do that, if I can just a bit of explanation of how we would like them to work. So when we move into breakout groups, you will be assigned automatically to a breakout group. You don't have to leave the meeting or do anything. An allocation has been determined randomly. And we just ask that you remember your room number when you do move into a breakout group, just in case you lose your connection and need to come back in. We will be asking that 1 or 2 people from each group provide feedback on behalf of the group once the breakout sessions have finished. You will have a moderator in your group. The moderator is there to encourage contributions for everyone, to keep you focused on your question and to probe reasons for your views. So they're there to help the functioning of the group, not to provide their opinions. And to be clear, they won't be offering to be the spokesperson for your group. So if you can cross that off your list, that would be great. Just a little bit on protocol. If you would like to come into the conversation, if you could raise your hand and the moderator will call you into the discussion. And if you can avoid speaking over each other, that would be great. If your moderator disappears, just keep going, don't stop. And if the last person speaking could call in the next person, that would be great. Obviously, be constructive, share your views, and importantly, share the reasons for your views. And we will put the question in the chat so that you can see it whilst you're in your breakout group. As Sam said at the beginning, you may have one of our advisory group members or country champion in your group, and they will be expressing their own views. So it will be good for you to hear that. And just finally, the breakout sessions will be recorded. That's for the benefit of the project team for us to follow up, and they won't be published at all. But the main group meeting is being recorded and will be published, but not these breakout groups. So please feel free to be as frank and honest as you would like. So without further ado, these are the questions that we have for you to consider in your breakout groups. Each breakout group will be given one question to consider. So the first question is about how NPOs are defined in your jurisdiction, and how does that align with our thinking about characteristics? Who are the key stakeholders for NPOs in your jurisdictions, and how do they fit with the groups that I just outlined to you? And what formal accountability arrangements to stakeholders from NPOs in your jurisdictions? So those are the three questions. And so you will now be sent to your breakout group. Dominique is kindly organising that, and we'll send you in a few seconds there. So please make the most of your time. You have about 20 to 25 minutes to discuss this, and we'll automatically bring you back into the main session when we're finished.
Karen, can I just come in just before you send us away, Dominique? As I mentioned at the beginning, just for those who've just joined in, rather than focusing about what is the reality in the States and in Canada, which we kind of know, it's really about which aspects do you think we could have really important international applicability, and thinking about your role as a grantor or an international operator could also be really relevant and bring that flavour to these questions. And I'm sure your moderators will help you do that as well. So don't be, really rigidly stuck to exactly what the question is. You can think about the broader context.
Okay.
So far, so good. Well done. So, it's not a bad.
I'm back in the room now, Dominique. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you had some good conversations in your groups. Would very much like to hear some of the key points that came out of your discussions. So we'll just go through room by room and ask each moderator to confirm which question they had and introduce the person who's going to speak on behalf of each of the groups. So I might just go in reverse order and start with you, Sarah, if you could confirm which question that you had and who's going to speak for your group.
Sorry, I was nearly caught by the mute button then. We were in group 4, we had a few problems. Not everybody could see the question, but in the end, I think we got there. We were talking about what formal accountability arrangements to stakeholders exist for NPOs in your jurisdiction. What are the advantages and disadvantages for accountability of these arrangements? How do they support good financial management? And that will be Martha Jones-Denning who'll be doing the presentation back for us. And I'm very grateful. We were very singular in our jurisdictions. I think a lot of the answers were on a similar theme, but Martha will be able to explain that all to us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Martha.
Okay, so we did have a lot of Canadian input, and I'll admit to being with the Canadian Public Sector Accounting Board. So, but we did have a number of Canadian participants. So most of our comments are related to that. We initially talked about some of the formal accountability arrangements that there were in Canada, including the preparation of full accrual general purpose financial statements provided to stakeholders. So following one gap or another, but all full accrual. The charity return to the Canada Revenue Agency for those those not-for-profits that are charities. And we also mentioned some of the issues that are important to not-for-profits in Canada, endowments, contribution, revenue recognition, and financial statement presentation. I think one of the themes that became very clear in our discussion was that you've got a broad range of not-for-profits, from the very small to a lot of the public sector ones that are quite big and get a lot of money, and that there's definitely a resource issue for the smaller entities in meeting some of the reporting requirements. So both the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency reporting requirements were mentioned, also those for provincial, federal and local government grant funding, that there are reporting requirements for all of those, and that the smaller entities just have a hard time handling those requirements. There was a comment that not-for-profit standards need to be beefed up in Canada. I think that one of the comments received from the private sector side was that, you know, the 4400 series for not-for-profits in Part 3 of the private sector handbook, that often you have to go back to the accounting standards for private enterprise, which is the base gap for those type of entities. So it would be nice to have more concrete standards that are specific to not-for-profits. I reflected on PSAB's experience with not-for-profits and the fact that it has a new benchmark reporting model out for comment in an exposure draft to its stakeholders. There is an illustrative set of financial statements for not-for-profits, and that PSAB might in the future look at some customizations for not-for-profits, but what's out for comment right now would be the benchmark. There was some mention of non-financial reporting, and that for non-financial reporting, comparability between entities is an issue, and that there are issues with vetting the information. So the benchmarks used in that type of reporting might not be realistic, especially for startup not-for-profits. I think another theme that came across was for stakeholders was consistency and comparability across not-for-profits. So donors and other resource providers can make decisions if the financial reports are comparable for all not-for-profits. And that for stakeholders, making sure that the financial reports and the standards are understandable is important for stakeholders, and that a global common language for financial reporting for not-for-profits would be helpful. I think generally the conclusion that I heard was that there are good accountability arrangements in Canada, and that the standards help provide this, but the average not-for-profit struggles to deal with and understand the standards.
Brilliant.
Anybody else in the group? Is there anything I missed? Is there anything?
If there is anything else from the group, perhaps you can put it in the chat. That would be great. If you have any further comments, or perhaps if anyone's got any questions, they can put that in the chat. So I'd like to move on to the next room and hear what they have to say. Martha, thank you very much for that. Very clear in terms of the feedback of the group. So I'll see how we develop that over the coming questions. So can I turn next to Jaime with question 2?
Yeah, thank you very much. So our group was about to discuss about who are the key stakeholders for NPOs, how these align with the consultation paper, and what information needs are common to these stakeholders. And we got the chance to have Patrick as the person who was taking notes, and will provide feedback to the group.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Patrick.
Hi. So in terms of the stakeholder groups, we identified the government both as a overall watchdog or overseer, as well as a subset of funders, other funders, beneficiaries and or members, the board, staff, lenders, watchdog organizations, and the public in general, inclusive of donors, either potential donors or existing donors. Something raised as part of that discussion was that if you're dealing in multiple jurisdictions, then those groups could be somewhat multiplicative, that your government environment in one country might be notionally very different than your government environment in another country that you're operating. And of course, that then creates an interaction between economies where there is an established accounting standard versus those where there isn't, and how that would all interact. Then we went into comparing those that we identified to the groups, the categories of stakeholder that are identified in the paper. And the one that we spent a fair bit of time on is the public as a stakeholder. And we went on a bit of a journey as to whether like who all that it involves. So it can be, as we said, individuals who've never given to you, but as taxpayers feel that they have an investment in the fact that somebody else got a tax break. And so there's these watchdogs. There's a more general as somebody, operating in the economy and having a responsibility, probably taking care of the more vulnerable, or possibly taking care of the more vulnerable in your community. And so I think we ended up with, we agree with this overarching circle, at least the graphic that we're looking of a societal responsibility, but that we were very confident in the graphic we were looking at. It really needed to be beefed up. It really needed to be shown as much more substantial, because in practice, it tends to be, it can be a very powerful stakeholder, this sort of nebulous. Anybody can sort of, anybody has a stake in your organization is quite important. And we felt, but couldn't say for sure, that it's not necessary in the document. It's also not necessarily sort of emphasized sufficiently. Then we delved in this idea of whether members, so this could be member organizations, and at least in Canada, it gets more complex legally because there's this, I would say, somewhat unique thing about definition of members in parts of Canada, but and whether the members effectively fall within users or beneficiaries, that box, or whether they fall within the resource providers. And I would say in the bulk of practical situations, yes, they do. I think that was a conclusion at the table. As somebody who lives in Ontario, I do happen to know that you can have somebody who is officially called a member who is neither of those things. And therefore, whether that's, needs to be addressed or not is another thing. We kind of got cut short in delving into the user needs. Use of money is definitely a big one. And there's two ways of looking at that. How well have you used your resources to move yourself towards your goals, and what are your goals, and so forth and so on. But unfortunately, often the questions are more functional of how much did you pay your executives, how much was your administrative, how much was your fundraising cost. Regardless of the validity of those are what stakeholders want to know. They do want to know about, what are you working towards and how effectively you're using the money, but they also want to know about exactly what you spend your money on. And because we got cut short, we didn't go any farther, but the one that I would throw in, which is a bit of a no-brainer, is the financial health of the organization. As a general rule, people don't want to give money to an organization that's on the brink of failure, to talk about a very far end of a spectrum. So, and then I would welcome anything that I've missed for people to weigh in from our group.
Thank you, Patrick. And again, I'd invite people, if they want to add anything else, to use the chat. It sounds like you had a very broad-ranging discussion, which is really great, and good to hear the coverage there. And I have to say, some of the things that you talked about resonate very strongly with me with conversations that we had along the way in getting to the consultation paper. So a bit of a comfort zone for me. So great. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to turn to the next room next, and the other group that got asked this question as well. So Mohammed, could you introduce, just confirm that you had that question, and who's going to speak on behalf of your room?
Yeah, thank you, Karen, for this. Yeah, we had the same question as Jaime in our group, and we had a very good discussion, very interesting, with involvement of the different participants, and we agreed that Sarah out of our discussion. So please, Sarah or Sandra, if you can come in.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'll
Hi, Sarah.
start and then maybe Sandra can add in.
Cool.
So in terms of the stakeholders that we discussed, just gonna run through them. So grant makers, funders, regulators, taxpayers, the government, lenders and bondholders, to make sure the orgs are acting responsibly, public watchdogs like the IRS in the US, state and local governments, and but also private sector watchdogs like Charity Navigator is well known.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, like the media was mentioned as a stakeholder. And lastly, I would mention the other NPOs as users. I don't know if anyone wants to add on to that, and boards of the NPOs. In terms of the common information, we didn't spend as much time on that as well, but fiscal sustainability was mentioned, and specifically commitments. We agreed that commitments were an important financial indicator for nonprofits.
Cool, great, thank you.
Sandra, do you want to?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. I think you captured it, most of the groups that we discussed. The only other thing that I would add is that we also did spend a little bit of time thinking about what key stakeholders that we identified and how they aligned with what was provided in the paper. And I think overall, we did feel that we had covered all the groups that were in the paper. And we did have a little talk about the difference between service users and resource providers, and where a donor would fall in, whether a service user or not. But we felt that overall the key stakeholders were covered by these groups.
Great.
So I don't know if anybody from our group wants to add in anything else, but.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Sandra. I think having the luxury of having the second bite at that question means that a lot of things have already been said. So if there is anything else that you'd like to have, again, if you can put that in the chat, that would be great. So I'm going to move on to our final room. Thank you very much. And Milka, do you want to introduce your question and who's speaking on behalf of your group? We got Milka.
We were very lucky in our group because we had 3 members from Canadian charities and 2 from the US. So it was a little bit balanced. And Janine Van Staden, who works in New York City, is going to be reporting on our group. And our question was, how are NPOs defined in your jurisdiction? What financial reporting issues arise from this definition? And what difference would the proposals in the IFR4NPO consultation paper make? So,
hi, thanks, Milka.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone. So, as Milka said, we were Canadian and American, and regarding the first question, how are NPOs defined? So, generally, we think it's in line with the paper. I think somebody spoke earlier about the complexities in Canada, but in general, since these are sort of vague, overarching type things, we think it applies to nonprofits in the US and in Canada. Our Canada has a tax code and sort of a company regulated that defines nonprofits. We have in the US, nonprofits are defined by the IRS, and that's kind of the one thing that I was wondering about is if this would include some kind of in the more than just what nonprofits do, but also how they are looked at with their governments. And maybe that's something that should be in the official comment making. But anyway, so we talked a lot about that. And then the next part of it, financial reporting issues. So both Canada and the US has nonprofit gap. Somebody mentioned earlier the Canadians think they need an update. I think, in the US, we had a pretty substantive overhaul in the last few years. So I think our standards are pretty good. Where we run into issues is, when you have overseas offices who are not necessarily on US GAAP, but they are branch offices. So, and for us, everybody's bookkeeping is done on US GAAP. But we do have, in a lot of countries, we have statutory audits under the local laws. And then, of course, our accounting is not right. So then we have to keep, a record of topside adjustments that gets carried over year to year, because we have to make some changes in our accounting to be able to present the right financial statements. So we did, sorry, I just want to take a look at my notes. So we did, in general, we think again, the financial reporting in this, the overarching principles will work with the US and Canadian accounting rules. I think, so we think that's good in this. A concern that was raised was, and I think you guys are well aware of this, but I think it can't be said enough that we really are going to need to have buy-in from donors and governments on this, or not governments. Yeah, I mean, maybe for the tax authorities, the company regulators, the standard setters, and then donors, right? Because we are concerned, if that it's one more report that we have to do, right? So maybe it's adopted here and there, but so it's just an extra report. And again, the smaller nonprofits they don't have the systems to just cope with this immediately. And they don't have the money to go out and buy these systems, right? So it's not, everybody doesn't have a big ERP that can cope with any reporting requirements, right? So yeah, I think that's it from us.
Thank you very much for that. It was good to cover something slightly different in your responses. So really, really good. If anybody from any of the groups wants to add anything that has been said, please do so in the chat. But I am going to move us on now to look at the next topic area, which is looking at cash and the premises behind the guidance that we're looking at, which is about accrual as the basis, and about non-financial information being part of the guidance as well. So just turning to the first premise then. So the first premise is that the guidance will be accrual based, and the chapter notes the types of financial reporting carried out in jurisdictions, and that financial reporting depends on a number of factors, which of course includes the local financial reporting guidance, the legal form of an entity, which can determine what guidance is needed, and the influence that donors have over the financial reporting of an entity, particularly in certain parts of the world. And so the consultation paper looks at three bases of accounts: cash, modified cash, and accrual. And so just for clarity, when we talk about cash, we mean economic events and transactions are recognized when the cash is received or paid, and that the assets and liabilities are not recognized. By modified cash, we mean that some economic events and transactions are recognised on a cash basis, but others may be recognised on an accrual basis, which means that some assets and liabilities may be recognised, but not all of them. And then by accrual, we mean that economic events and transactions are recognised when the event occurs, and therefore all assets and liabilities are recognised. So those are the three bases that we talk about in the consultation paper, and we compare the advantages and disadvantages of each of those bases in terms of how well they meet the guidance objectives that I shared with you at the beginning of this section. And in doing that, and in the chapter generally, we acknowledge that donors frequently require cash-based information as part of their reporting cycle, which is an important factor. So the analysis acknowledges possible challenges around knowledge and capability to use accrual-based standards, and also the potential for complexity that might be introduced if a full accrual basis is used, particularly for very small entities. But in the chapter, we also explain that accrual-based accounting is internationally recognised as the best basis to provide a comprehensive view of an organisation's financial performance and position. And because of that, it meets our objectives around quality, transparency, accountability and decision making. So that this is in a very nutshell what the paper says about accrual-based information. We also talk in there, our second premise is about that the guidance will include non-financial reporting. Arguably, this is more important for non-profit organisations than for other types of entity, as it provides an opportunity to explain more about what the organisation is delivering that you wouldn't necessarily find in the financial statements, and kind of an important part of what non-profits want to communicate. So non-financial reporting might include areas such as an entity's nature, that is, you know, what's its purpose, its objectives and forward strategy. Could also look at its risks and regulatory compliance. It can also use non-financial reporting to demonstrate the impact that its projects and programs are having and the wider impact of its activities. So non-financial reporting can provide context to financial information, and it can also provide additional information about the organisation's projects and programs. And through this, non-financial reporting can be useful in meeting the broader information needs of stakeholders. So that's how non-financial reporting is positioned in the paper. So that's just a brief introduction to what is included in chapter 3 of the consultation paper. And I'm going to keep us moving just in the interest of time. So as before, we have some questions to ask about this topic. So a question about the basis for general purpose financial reporting. I think, as we've acknowledged earlier, you know, accrual-based information is generally what's used in the US and in Canada. Particularly interested in the very small entities and where does the line get drawn and challenges around that, but also interested in the regulatory aspects of that. Then there is a question about how accrual accounting could support and improve accountability and financial management. So good to get your experiences of that to feed into that kind of global debate. And then finally about the requirements that currently exist in your jurisdiction for non-financial reporting information. So what happens now and how well does that work? So as before, we're going to move you into breakout groups. This time you probably got sort of 20 minutes maximum to discuss this particular topic, and then we'll bring everybody back at the end. So I'm going to stop sharing now and Dominique will now send you out into your various groups.
And it's mostly the same as last time. I think there's one shift because somebody left, so there's been a little bit of rejigging, but otherwise it should be the same.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dominique.
Thank you very much, and hopefully another useful set of conversations in your groups. I'm conscious of time, and I don't want people to drop out before the end of the meeting. So can I ask that when people provide feedback is probably to focus on the key things from your discussions. We have the recording, so we're not going to lose any of the input that you've made, but just to try and make sure that we can honor your time commitment to us today. So if we can go through each of the rooms, I'm going to start with room 1. Milka, can you introduce your question and the person who's going to speak on behalf of your group?
Of course, and we decided on gender balance. So Sam Marinucci is going to be reporting out. And the question was, how are NPOs defined in your jurisdiction? Oh, sorry. What is the accounting basis for general purpose financial reporting for NPOs in your jurisdiction? Who is the regulator that sets this? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of your existing general purpose financial reporting guidance? And Sam will report out.
Okay, thank you very much, Milka. Hi, Sam.
Hi everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Stephen Ball for volunteering me to be the spokesperson for my group. In our discussion, our group consists of people from Canada and the US. In Canada, there are 2 standard setters for accounting. One is the Accounting Standards Board that sets standards for private not-for-profits. And then there is the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board that sets standards for government and quasi-government entities such as governments themselves, municipalities, hospitals, and so on. The fiscal regulator is the Canada Revenue Agency, which requires that a charity file annual charity returns. Actually, those returns do not necessarily have to follow GAAP. It follows more of a receipts and expenditures basis, so that can cause some issues between the formal financial statements and the charity return. If an NPO is not a charity, it needs to file a corporation tax return. There are no corporation taxes to pay generally, but it in essence is an information return. There are also provincial charities regulators that dictate how the charities are supposed to be run and to continue to meet the statutory requirement of charitable activities, not as much involved in the financial part. In the US, a similar situation, the FASB is the accounting standard setter for accounts for, again, a private, not-for-profit sector, and the GASB, the Government Standards Board, does so for governments, hospitals, municipalities, etc. There's also each state's Attorney General's office deals with regulation of the charities in the state, and then the IRS, which sets the annual filing for charities. Advantages and disadvantages. Couple of comments here. The overall accounting standards are supposed to, apply to all organizations, whether large or small. That could present some challenges to the smaller organizations where it has to sort out whether any particular standards are applicable. And of course, that involves money and resources, which smaller organizations don't tend to have. Another issue is the accounting standards do provide some options in how to report certain transactions. So you could have similar transactions that are reported differently depending on which of the options you choose. That could be an advantage or a disadvantage, depending on one's point of view. I guess the main issue with an overall global set of standards is if an organization is operating in different jurisdictions that may have their own local requirements which differ. And again, that prevents some comparability issues. But as long as those differences are explained or disclosed in the financials, there should be transparency and disclosure. And then finally, especially in the US, because of some flexibility in the accrual and the application of accrual basis, the larger organizations tend to go towards full accrual as much as possible to ensure that to one of the participants, no money is left on the table from donors, because the accounting is considered to be the preferable one. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sam. And it was really interesting to hear that. It sounds quite complex set of regulation. Maybe in practice, when you're doing it, it seems simpler than that, but lots of different strands. That's a really interesting to hear. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to the next room, room 2, if I can take Mohammed next.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. So we discussed in the group the question that is related to the non-financial information reporting, and we had mainly 2 topics to discuss. The first one was related to the current requirements that currently exist in each jurisdiction, and the second aspect was related to the advantages and disadvantages of the existing non-financial information reporting arrangements. And we agreed that Jeffrey will present the main points that we have discussed together. Jeffrey, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mohammed. Can you guys all hear me?
Yep, Jeffrey can hear you loud and clear.
Terrific. Terrific. So earlier, I think when we were reporting out the first round of group summaries, we talked about the standards for nonprofits, the accounting standards being, the financial accounting standards being robust in the US and in Canada. And so therefore, the benefit of IFR4NPO may be somewhat more limited in terms of financial reporting in our 2 countries, except again as grant makers and so forth. However, in the area of non-financial reporting, we think we could significantly benefit in both countries. In both countries, there is limited to no current requirements for non-financial reporting. For example, in the US, the FASB has no requirements around management's discussion analysis or any narrative reporting. And the Internal Revenue Service only has some very limited requirements about programmatic accomplishments in the IRS Form 990. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board does have some requirements around MD&A, but the GASB only really oversees or is involved with public universities and governmental hospitals, which is a relatively smaller part of the nonprofit sector. The AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, does have a white paper that gives some best practices and so forth for managements and discussion and analysis. But otherwise, because of these very limited to almost non-existent requirements, it's the quality and the comparability of the information varies significantly. Some organizations, especially larger ones, do a fair amount of narrative reporting in MD&As on their websites or elsewhere. Others do much more limited, and again, the quality and the consistency is all over the place. And from what I gather from what Sandra has mentioned in our groups, it's pretty similar in Canada as well. Canada, the 2 standard setters don't have requirements around non-financial reporting, though there is a statement of recommended practice in this area. And again, because of all of this, A lot of it is voluntary and it's very inconsistent across Canada, just like it is across the US. So again, this could be an area where both of our countries could significantly benefit from learning about what's done around the rest of the world and what comes out of the IFR4NPO initiative.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So it sounds like some similarities in your groups in terms of experience, but an opportunity there to be grasped. So which is good to hear.
Karen, the one other thing I'd say here is that a couple of our members said that not only is this important, but this is for some users of financial statements, this may be the most important information, more important than information that's even contained in the financial statements and financial reports themselves.
Great, useful to hear that. Thank you very much. Thanks for that. And if anyone from the group wants to add, please use the chat to do that. So I'm going to turn to Sarah next. I think your group also had this question. I don't know if you can introduce your spokesperson for your group.
Yeah, I won't read out the question again since as that's already done. And yes, we have similarities with Jeff, and that's good to see you again, Jeff. We have two people doing ours. We have Martha and Thomas. We're going to have a dual-handed presentation. I'm very grateful to both Martha and Thomas for doing it.
Thank you very much.
Since you did it alphabetically, I guess that means I'm starting. So following up with what Jeff just said, yes, in Canada, we do not have any requirements for non-financial reporting, but I'll let Thomas speak to that because there is a nuance there. I'll let Thomas speak to that one. We too had suggestion, a conclusion that for some stakeholders, the non-financial information is more important to some stakeholders than the financial statements, that it's more understandable. You can provide them with the story about your financial statements and that they appreciate that and might not understand the financial statements as well. Jeffrey mentioned the financial statement discussion and analysis statement of recommended practice that we have in Canada. There's also a public performance reporting SORP in Canada as well. They're voluntary, not mandatory, but they're positioned as, if you decide to do this type of reporting, this is how we recommend you do it, to try and get at some of that commonality and consistency. But we don't know that to the extent to which not-for-profits, government not-for-profits, have actually taken up the SORPs. We know more about what governments have done. Maybe I'll let Thomas step in.
Great, thank you very much, Martha. Thomas, do you want to come in?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, everyone. So the challenge we had in discussing it, we also scratched our heads to say, are there any real regulatory requirements, which Martha's talked about and Jeffrey's talked about. So there's really no regulatory requirements, but it's typical that you do have non-financial information based on either an AGM or an annual report that you have, where it really talks about the entity's programs, objectives, volunteer contributions. And the real advantage is it really does help the stakeholders understand the NPO. And if you beyond the financial statement, because they're all saying the same thing, that it's a lot more times a lot more important than that. The only disadvantage I've seen is that because it's not really regulated, sometimes the information is very broad-based, and they should stay with the mega issues. So if someone's looking at that non-financial information, it should be distinct in nature, so they do get a good understanding of the organization. I think we're all agreeing around the same point about this.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. That was really, really helpful. I'm going to move on to our final group now. So that is Jaime, if you would like to jump into the last question. And with the clock ticking down, I'm not going to put any pressure on you, but if we can move into the last one, that would be great. Jaime, are you there?
Yeah, thank you very much. So actually, our question was, how do we think that accrual accounting could support and improve credibility in our organizations, and also what could prevent these improvements from happening? So we've got Marie to comment on behalf of our group. So I welcome Marie to do that.
Thank you, Marie.
In the interest of time, I will keep it brief and try to just add information versus repeating. But a lot of what has been discussed did come into our discussion within our group, and I think our thoughts, a couple of additional things as some of the members of our discussion group were resource providers. They did talk about the diversity of information and accounting practices that the organizations reporting to them do follow, and that there is a perceived benefit to having consistency across all reporting. However, a great focus of our discussion really was on the cost benefit of being able to do so and do so in an effective and successful way. So as we think of accrual basis accounting, we talked about the reality that certain organizations are just not resourced either in the abilities and technical knowledge or in the having the funds to set up the systems that would support an accrual basis accounting system, and that we felt that there was a real breaking point between the cost benefit of having that accrual basis reporting versus the cost of setting it up, and that should be taken into consideration as something that's incorporated into these requirements if it's something that you go forward with. We talked about it as, from one sense, if these requirements are put into place, imposing requirements on organizations that aren't able to meet them is not going to get the desired results. So requiring an organization that doesn't have the wherewithal to put forward an accrual basis accounting system, we're not going to get quality information from them, and that is a negative and won't get that desired outcome, as well as there likely being a lot of disagreement with putting these requirements in place to begin with if it's a one and all requirement to go to that accrual basis of accounting. I don't know if anyone else has anything else from our group in the chat that I missed, but I think those are the highlights.
Great, thank you very much, Marie. Good to get a different perspective on there, because there are so many, and that's why we have that as part of our objectives around the cost benefit, because I think it's a really important consideration. So thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody who's participated in the breakout groups, and particularly if you volunteer to be someone to feedback from the group. So lots of rich things that have come out of the discussion, which are really helpful for us as a project. I'm just going to hand back to Sam briefly just to wrap up today's session.
Great, thank you, Karen. So very quickly, just to say thank you so much for your participation. It's been really stimulating, really interesting to hear the differences of the kinds of answers we're getting in different regions. If you have anything you'd like to follow up, please email me, especially as this is the first of 2 sessions. If you have any feedback and how we can make the next one better, then let us know. I'd love to just take a quick photo. I've got you all in gallery view. If we can just do 1, 2, 3, smile, and I'm going to take a photo. Social media, you know, it's the age, isn't it? 1, 2, 3, smile. Super, thank you very much. So with that, thank you very much. Hope you have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah,
bye.
Great.
I think the moderators are going to stay on for a few minutes.
Yes. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much, everyone.